Hello, everyday leaders. This is Melahni Ake coming to you from the Everyday Leaders studio in Indianapolis, Indiana. And all week, we're bringing you wonderful guests that are adding value to your life, overcoming obstacles, and teaching us the
Mhm.
values that they are celebrating through COVID-19, starting businesses, starting podcasts, and helping us overcome things that we're struggling with. Tonight, my guest is Gregory Rice and his new podcast I want to share with you, The Art of Communication. This is going to be a great lesson. So I want you to get out your journals and take down all these notes or hashtag replay and tell us what you learned because this is going to be really fun. So thank you, Greg, first of all, for just joining and being a guest here right before the holidays. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
This is so fun. I remember our first conversation, and you said, "Okay, I've been referred to you, connected to you, and I'm starting a podcast called The Art of Communication." And so, how long ago was that? Like a year ago? 6 months ago? It feels like
I'm gonna go with 6 months or so. I
6.
think I think I officially launched in maybe May or so.
Yes. But the thing is you were really intentional because you said, "Okay, this is what my design is. These are the kinds of guests that I wanna bring on." And so I think a lot of people that are struggling with, "How do I start a podcast? What's the theme gonna be?" What really drove you to decide the name and the brand of your podcast?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that there was, it was a roundabout process that took some time, right? So I'll kind of take you back to the overall evolution of it, right? So it actually all started when well, first of all, I've always been fascinated in communication. On one hand, on the other hand, I've always kind of had a knack for connecting with people and selling and those kinds of things, right? And I've always had a passion for it. So I was doing the Knowledge Broker Blueprint, the Dean Graziosi and Tony Robbins program, and that got me thinking about, well, where could I really leverage my expertise? How could I share with the world what my knowledge is, learn more, and continue to add value, right? And so that's why I started to come up with the idea around communication and master classes and coaching. But on during that program, there was a section on podcasting, and it was from JLD John Lee Dumas. And he just kind of gave an hour on how he started his podcast. And I just saw the value of number one, right? You get to build an audience, which is great. Number two, though, you get to build a network of the people you have on the show. Number three, you get to learn along the way because, I'm not an expert in everything. I'm learning every day, and there's a ton for me still to learn. And then number four, you get to add value too. Like you're putting out free content to help people be better at communicating. So for me, it was a win-win, win-win, right? It was a really great concept for where I was trying to go. So that's why I decided to kind of start my coaching, mentorship practice, if you will. And along those lines, I reached out to John Lee Dumas. And I said, "Hey, John, I loved kind of what you shared, Knowledge Broker Blueprint. I'd love to learn about starting my own podcast." So he does not do coaching anymore, but he connected me with Travis Chappell. And Travis has a number of very successful podcasts. And Travis is the one that really coached me up as a mentor on how to do a podcast right. And it was really his guidance that I think helped me be so intentional and so focused on the right things. He kept pushing me to say, well, what's my vision? Who's my avatar? Who's my target? What am I sharing? What value do they need that I want to give them? So I'm not just talking about everything, because communication is a really broad topic, right? So tying what I learned from Travis together with kind of what my passion and interest was, as well as what I was good at, I think brought it all together to a very, very intentional focus, if you will. And it's been a lot of fun.
Mhm. And you're really good at it because you have gotten really focused. And that's what I
Thank
love is you can take a topic, right, and say what's on your heart, but I have so many clients that I say, "It's usually right in front of you, and you just don't know it." You just are
you.
working so hard to find, like, "What's the billboard tell me?" And sometimes it's just tweaking it a little bit and saying, "Okay, if my grandma or my mom was sitting there listening, what would they need to learn?" And so
Mhm.
that doing that exercise is really important, and then you can kinda craft, like, okay, what messages and then you get really a lot of clarity after you start your consistency, right?
Mhm.
That's what we've all found out, and it's so great because you start to have really a lot of fun with it instead of the stress of, "Oh my gosh, who am I gonna have, and what am I gonna ask my guest?" It really
Mhm.
becomes kind of a journey for you, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think over time, as you do more interviews and you do more solo shows, right, you start to get and you get more questions from your audience and you understand what's important to them. You start to get a lot more clarity about the direction that you should go in. And your point about kind of being stressed about who to have on the show and who to ask, one key thing that I suggest for anybody starting a podcast is build a bank of interviews before you launch. Right. I had about 30 or so interviews done before I launched the podcast so that I'm always a couple months ahead of time. So I'm never struggling for an interview that I have to post next week. So it's about building content early. And that was huge as far as my comfort level with doing the podcast in the
Mm,
first place.
that's
Because I'm not necessarily good. If I need to do it next week, I want to be really stressed about it.
Well, exactly, because you have a family, right? You have responsibilities. And
Hmm.
so for people that are really doing this, like, be structured, plan it out, really think into who you want your guest to be. And the thing is, then you can kind of release and build up the energy of what this guest is going to look like and being able to tell your audience, right? This is what's coming. This is
Hmm.
what we're going to talk about, and do some clips and audio waves like you've done. I love that. The thing that we had when we promoted out, and it was really fun because people got a glimpse of, here's what's going to happen, here's what you can find. And so
Hmm.
people being really creative and going to YouTube and doing audio versus audio and video. And I
Hmm.
think, that's a lot of the questions that we get from people that are trying to learn this business is which one's best, right? And so I would say, well, it's what fits you, right?
Hmm.
If you wanna start the audio, or you can do this and keep the audio and still push it up to, a file of any of your podcast providers, and just make sure that, you're consistent, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think there's any reason you can't do both, right? If you're doing video, you can certainly strip the audio out and use that as your podcast, as long as you do that intentionally and you're thinking about that ahead of time as you structure everything. And, I do my interviews over video. So as you mentioned, we'll pull out snippets, minute long snippets that we'll share on social media. And we'll do kind of a highlights where it'll be the 3 or 4 highlights and kind of a 5-minute video that we'll put up on YouTube. So there's definitely ways to do both. And one other note I wanted to go back to, thinking about how I prepare to talk to guests and the questions I'm going to ask. I don't spend a tremendous amount of time doing it. I maybe spend an hour per guest, maybe an hour and a half. But the process is similar, like we did, right? I set up an intro call, lasts about 15 minutes or so, where I get to know more about you and what you're all about, what your expertise is in, what's important to you. And then I take that and I spend maybe a half hour to an hour doing my own research, looking at your website, your products, your LinkedIn, looking at the topic that you're most interested in, right? And I just build out a list of questions. It's a Word document, no more than a page. And I just use those questions to guide our discussion. It's nothing that's complicating or complex. It's actually pretty easy to do and really enjoyable.
Mhm. And it's fun, and when you start to get, really keen on who your guest is, right, and what your audience is gonna wanna learn from that guest, I think that's what's fun about it, is because you say, "Okay, if nobody else has asked them this question, I'd like to know this," like, "What was your favorite dog?" What dog did you have growing up? What are your kids' names, right? It's fun because you develop a personal connection, and then from there, you can become collaborators, partners, all kinds of things can happen between that relationship. And so that's what really you need to open your mind if you're going to begin a journey like this, branding, getting the right guests, really spending time researching, like you said, and pouring into them, because that's
Mhm.
really key. Adding value, basic arts of communication, right? Being able to listen, add value, and really show up and celebrate the things that they're doing. So I really appreciate that, because a lot of people are asking right now, especially through COVID, how do I start? Where do I start? I have no
Mhm.
idea. I'm so stressed about it, but I want to get my message out. So
Mhm.
I think it's really, really important for people to think that they have power in their voice.
Mhm. And I absolutely agree with that. I think you always know at least a little bit more than somebody else that can add value for somebody. And I think the key to getting started is understanding where those things collide as far as what you're good at and interested in and what can add value to others. And it doesn't have to be all that complicating. Like for me, the art of communication is, it's just something that I'm really interested in. I have some knowledge about it, but certainly not all the knowledge. But I had faith as I took on this journey that I would learn a whole lot, and that I don't necessarily have to be the expert. I just want to talk to the experts.
Mhm.
So I think that that is key. And then I think planning ahead of time as far as what your show structure is going to be. You know, how many episodes do you want to do? What kind is going to be solo episodes or interviews? How many a week do you want to do? How are you going to produce it? So I work with a company who produces my episodes for me, right? If I had to produce them, it wouldn't be something I'd be on top of, right? I'm not good about structured processes like that. And I know that about myself. So I invest a little bit of money to have somebody else produce the episodes for me. Similarly, have a VA do my social media work, right? So they pull together those snippets for me and I check them and then they post them for me. And all those things are very helpful, but it's about knowing yourself and knowing the process that's going to make the most sense for you. And if you just want to do 15 minutes a week, you know, that can be a great place to start just to get your feet wet. And start small, you know. The first episode you put out there, probably nobody's going to hear it anyway. So it's a matter of getting your feet wet and getting good at it. And then you build up your audience over time. It certainly takes time to build up an audience.
Mhm. And I think it's being authentic to your own soul because as you build that, your first one may not be the greatest thing ever, and you're gonna go back, like
Mhm,
John Maxwell says, "You don't even wanna read my first book," right? But the thing is, if you stay consistent in your own voice,
mhm.
you do start to build that community and that brand, and it's what you're about, and so people will really start to come to you as a resource, and so I wanna ask you, though, what do you think is the biggest thing that you've learned over the past 6 months in doing this?
It's a great question. You know, I think I've learned two things, or at least it's two things that are, I'd say, two sides of the same coin when it comes to connection and communication and relationships. One is the importance of being vulnerable. So by that, I mean, I don't mean, you know, being weak or whining or anything like that, right? It's about sharing your true authentic self and not trying to be that fake person who knows everything. So on my podcast, I've learned to not try to be the expert, but be okay not having the answer. Be okay asking silly questions sometimes. You know, be okay sharing how I feel about something in an honest way, right? That's what being vulnerable is. When you tell about a story or an experience, share how you felt about it, share what it meant to you, share why it was important, not just what happened, right? That's vulnerability for me, and that's how you connect with other people. Once you open up to them, they're much more likely to open up to you. And the flip side of that coin is the importance of empathy, right? So understanding what I just talked about in somebody else, what's important to them, what feelings are driving their actions and their behaviors. Really paying attention for who they are, not just the surface level of kind of what they're telling you initially, and not being afraid to ask that next question to dig deeper into the heart of whatever it is that you're talking about.
Mhm.
I think when those two things are combined, relationships just blossom, conversation blossoms, and connection blossoms. So does influence. And that's really what I've learned how valuable those two things are.
Mm, that's so powerful. Because every single person that you meet, they have something that you don't know. They have something to teach
Mhm,
us, right? And if you can get down to that and really touch their heart, that's the key. Like, tell me something that really moved you, that changed you, that made you become this person that you are. And I love it because this journey, on my podcast is going to be going on 4 years here in January. And I think the stories that I've learned, the people that I didn't think that I could connect to, but then I'm like, yeah, but they're on the same journey that I am. Why wouldn't they wanna share a story? And so it gives you, like you said, vulnerability to kinda show up in the space and say, "But I just wanna learn from you," right?
mhm.
Then it gives you that permission to say, "Okay, then what's next?" And so I think it is really, really important to be authentic in that space and learn, right? Be a learner, lean in and have that empathy. Those are
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really big on true influence coming from being more like yourself rather than less like yourself. There's a lot of content out there about persuasion and manipulation, but I think true influence comes from being more of yourself and understanding the true essence of whoever it is that you're communicating with and trying to influence.
mm,
And that's just been a really interesting take for me, and something that I've been diving more deeply into as I'm thinking about how to teach others to communicate and connect more effectively.
mhm. So, I've gotta ask you this question. So, as you're building your guest list, who is somebody that you're thinking like, I would love now, what I'm learning, I would love to be able to understand their perspective on the art of communication?
Mm. There's so many people out there, right? Who I'd love to talk to. It really is a great question. Um, there's some people out there that are probably completely out of reach, at least today, right? Like, say, an Oprah Winfrey, who's a tremendous communicator and connector, a Barack Obama, who I think is a tremendous communicator, John Maxwell, you mentioned, another guy who's a tremendous leader who I think I could learn so much from, Chris Voss, a tremendous negotiator. Um, those are a couple that jump to the top of my mind who I'd love to have on the show someday. And I kind of aspire to get there. I'll get there someday, but it's going to take a while. I got to build up the credibility to be able to get there and then wait for them to have their next book come out.
But you know what? If you speak it, that's when you start thinking about it. And then you're like, okay, when I meet that next one person, that might be the connection to get you to the step
Mhm.
that you need. So sometimes when we just speak into it, then we start to take those actions that can really get us there a little bit quicker.
Yeah. Well, it's so true. And I'll tell you, just doing a podcast gets you connected to so many people who you otherwise would have no ability to meet with. So I had Jordan Harbinger on the show, right? Jordan is one of the top podcasters in the world. I'd have no way of communicating with him or connecting with him outside of the podcast. It was a great discussion. A guy like Tommy Swanhouse, who's one of the most influential people on Instagram, had him on the show. And a little story there, thinking about not needing to be perfect when you start your podcast. So I think he was the second interview that I actually published and put out there. We did the entire interview, hung up. I went to save it, realized I never hit record. So I had to call him up and beg him to redo the whole interview. And he was super gracious. He was so willing to do it. We went and did it again like it was the first time. It ended up being awesome. But it was so embarrassing, right? So you don't have to be perfect. You will have struggles and you'll find a way to make it work out.
I have to share a story. It happened to me too. We were interviewing an executive, a Disney executive, Lee Cockrell, and same thing. And Joe's my producer, and we were having so much fun. And I was so excited because I worked at Disney, and that was one of my like go-to lists. Like, I want to find Lee Cockrell. And he was so gracious and said, absolutely, I would love to come on the show. And so as we were recording, we were talking and just having a great time. And he was about 5 minutes in, and just telling his history. And I was just so excited. And I got this look from across the studio. And I'm like, what? And he was pointing down, and I'm like, oh my God, Lee, we got to start over. So Joe says it was the first time he's ever been fired by a Disney executive, right? But what a great memory, because it's those people that give you permission to be vulnerable in that space. And
Mhm.
when you go, keep going, like, that's okay, because everybody makes mistakes. And the thing is, if you're showing up authentically, you're really wanting to connect your heart to learn a lesson and to share that with others. That's why we do what we do.
Yeah, for sure. Just from a leadership perspective, I can tell you, folks who throughout my career, I always loved hearing stories about how folks I looked up to in my leadership had failed miserably in the past. It made me feel so much more comfortable to make my own mistakes and struggle in my own way. So now when I'm leading others, or when I've led other people in my career, I try to do the same thing. Like, not that I'm a failure, right? But hey, a really funny story about this situation I had where I really messed up. It just makes them feel more comfortable, and they can learn from my mistakes, so maybe they don't make the same mistake.
That's exactly right. And we make them every day, right?
Mhm. For sure.
Oh my goodness. It is so much fun to talk to you, Greg, because I know we spent a lot of time together, but we really hadn't connected much before you reached out and said, hey, somebody said that I should have you on this podcast because it's called The Art of Communication. And you're
Mhm.
interviewing all these leaders. And so I'd love to learn more about, like, you grew up in Pittsburgh, but now you're actually close to me. You're
Mhm.
right over here in the Cincinnati area. And so for your family, like, what are you guys doing through COVID-19, and how are you surviving all of this?
Yeah, so a little bit of, I guess, background, right? So you're aware, but I'll tell the audience. So I have 5 kids, ages that range from 3 to 19. 4 of them are actually adopted internationally. So our 2 middle kids were the first 2 kids that we brought home. My son Tobias, who is currently 15, came home first when he was a baby. About a year and a half later, we brought home Lily from Guatemala. She is currently 13. Hard to remember all the ages. They just had birthdays. Then we brought home 2 older kids from China. and they were 8 and 9 and didn't speak any English at the time, right? So you talk about the art of communication. How do you communicate with somebody for 6 months who doesn't speak the same language as you do, right? We use smartphone apps and a lot of pointing and figuring things out, right? That's how we communicated for 6 months. But they're great kids. They're doing great now. They're 18 and 19. And then we have our own biological 3-year-old. But anyway, so unfortunately, we all ended up, not all of us, but most of us ended up getting COVID about month and a half ago, I guess. My wife is a teacher at a Catholic school, so they were still in school. And one of the teachers came in even though she wasn't feeling well. Got like 6 of the other teachers sick, got a bunch of the kids sick. My wife brought it home unknowingly to us, and everybody but me and my oldest daughter ended up getting it. Somehow my oldest daughter and I didn't. We tested negative. So we had the longest quarantine, even though we didn't have it, right? That's kind of a funny side effect of it. But other than that, right, we've been staying at home and surviving and getting a little stir crazy from time to time. But for the most part, we're doing okay. I work from home anyway, so it's not that different for me, other than I don't get to go out very much or go anywhere.
Mhm. So how has communication, and I want to ask you the story because your Art of Communication podcast, but what do you think has been the biggest influence or the biggest change for your kids going from, a normal school environment to now all this technology with us all being zoomed out? What do you see? What are you kind of watching and visualizing them kind of changing through all this?
So it so much depends on the kid, right?
Mhm.
So my oldest, she is at a point like she's doing complete online learning, and that's what she was doing at the beginning of the year. So she works at her own pace. And at 2 o'clock today, she was still asleep. My wife woke her up. It's not ideal. It's not usual for her to sleep that long, but she does sleep in for sure. But it works. She's way ahead, and she gets her work done, and she gets it done fine. I'll go from oldest to youngest, I guess. My second oldest, he is really, really good at school in all forms. But since he's been home, it's much harder for him to manage his time on his own. He ends up doing a lot of everything's like due at midnight now. Like they give him the extra time till midnight. So he's always last minute trying to get assignments done from like 10 o'clock till midnight, even though he knew he had them for 3 days. That was never how he was before, but he's still doing well. It's just that's the approach that he's taking now.
Wow, so he has changed his approach.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's probably the approach he's going to take to college. But as long as he continues doing well, that's kind of a natural college approach in a way. It's certainly, I think it was my approach. Wait till the last minute, then work really, really hard and do well anyway. But then my third oldest, my son, so he has ADHD. And he's been working in the kitchen lately instead of his room. And he'll have 2 computers in front of him, right? Because one he's like working on, one he's in class. Then he has a phone where he's talking to his friends. Then he has music on over here. So there's like 4 things going on at once. I walk in there and it just drives me nuts just to be in all that noise. But it works for him because his brain is so scattered. That's kind of the way that it works, which is interesting. And then my other daughter who's in school, she kind of, she's taken to it okay. She's kind of she's the most sociable of them all, so she really misses her friends. But she's managing it okay. She kind of hangs out in our bedroom actually and does all her schoolwork in there because it's more spacious than her room. But so they've certainly shifted the way that they're approaching school, but I think they're all succeeding at this point anyway. We'll see when kind of the grades come back for the 9 weeks, but as far as I know, they're succeeding.
Isn't that amazing to kind of watch all of that span? That's why I wanted to ask you that question, because so many families right now have just transitioned and said, I didn't work at home, or I now am working at home. And you didn't really have anything to change. But watching the kids figure out like how are they going to connect? Because communication is about connecting, right?
Mhm.
So if you don't connect, you're going to have a hard time studying or saying, I don't get this, or I'm going to change my habits. So I love that your one son has really kind of changed his habits and said, I can do this. I get it. I absorb and then I can just do it on my own. So I
Yeah.
had this responsibility of kids owning where they are and saying, okay, I'm accountable. I got this, right? I got it.
Yeah.
And
And that's important. That's
yeah,
important for us.
it's
We let them own it as long as they continue to succeed with it, right? And if they don't succeed, then they're going to suffer the consequences from that, and they understand that for the most part.
Mhm.
From a communication perspective, though, what's been really interesting is so my wife's a teacher, right? So she teaches a variety of things. She's like a support person at the Catholic school where she helps a lot of the kids who are struggling, helps train a lot of the teachers, but then she also teaches middle school math.
Mm.
And so they've been so bounced around because they were in class, then they were teaching from home, then they were back in school, but they were teaching remotely from school, then they were back at home, and they flipped around so many times, and they're exhausted, number one. Number two, the way they communicate with their class has changed so much, and their ability to connect with the class has changed so much. And some of the kids are struggling because they don't have that in-person help that they normally would. And it's funny. My wife just showed me the other day. One of her students videotaped her because she's silly, right? So she was dancing to like they had like an alarm when they ran out of time, and she was dancing to it, and somebody videotaped it and put it on TikTok, right? And those are things she never had to think about before,
Mhm.
And she also found out the other day, like kids were in a separate Google chat room talking about some video game during class when they were also in her chat room. So she had to shut down all the side chat rooms, right? She had to figure out how to do that. So there's a lot of stuff changing from a teacher's perspective on how do you teach and how do you connect with kids. And the sad part is I think a lot of kids are losing out and struggling a lot more than they normally would because they're not getting that in-person instruction. But on the other hand, I certainly understand the reason why. So I'm not advocating either that we put folks' lives at risk and send them to school, but I understand the challenge.
Mhm. Man, well, so what would one lesson be if you could teach tonight, if you could teach every parent, because 'cause you're a parent, obviously, and you're watching this from your wife being a teacher, what do you think one lesson could be for the art of communication that every single person could practice to improve on their communication through COVID?
I think it goes back to what I talked about before and the two sides of the coin of vulnerability and empathy. But my focus is a little bit more on empathy here, in that sitting back and watching and listening and really trying to understand who, in my case, my kids are, right, and why they're taking the approaches that they're taking. I'll give you a little bit of an example. I think I shared on my podcast at some point, but so my son with ADHD, I mentioned before,
Mhm.
he like there was a point during COVID when he was staying up really late and he had to get up for school, and I was pretty unhappy about that. I'm kind of a stickler for wanting some discipline and some focus. But talking to my wife, paying attention, I learned that that's the only time that his friends were kind of free and they were, playing games. That was the only social time they had because they couldn't see each other anymore. So that was really important for him to have that time, even though many had to stay up a little bit later. So once I understood what was going on at a deeper level, it was easier for me to see why he was making the decisions he was making. And I could make a better decision on how I interacted with him around that. Um, and it's the same deal with how they all have different study habits now. A year ago, maybe I'd be on them all about, hey, get it done earlier. Hey, don't have all the stuff on at the same time. Hey, do this, do that. But now I'm sitting back and watching and trying to learn from them and learn what approach works for them, because the approach that works for me is probably not the approach that works for them.
Mm,
I've also learned that whatever I think is going on is probably not what's really going on in their head. There's always more to it than I realize. So the more sure I am about it, the more wrong I probably am.
mm,
Having that assumption is critical.
mm. That's so important. I think when you talk about this, we teach all the time, meeting people where they are. And so just for this, like the lesson of meeting your family, meeting your kids, meeting your spouse where they are, and just having empathy and compassion, because this is tough when we're changing. But my goodness, we can learn so much from each other, can't we?
Yeah, yeah, and it also gives you opportunity to have more quality time together, which we probably don't take enough advantage of. We do a little bit. I think we do more together than we would normally. We're definitely less running around to different sports and things like that. But with the older kids, a lot of them are in the room a lot of the time. So we probably don't take enough of advantage of this time that we have together. And we should probably take more advantage of that.
Mhm. Man. Well, I this has been so much fun, Craig.
I've enjoyed it. Yeah, definitely.
Would you, I wanna share again for people that have just joined us or have, are watching the replay here. Greg's got a group, and then the podcast is The Art of Communication. So I wanted to put that on here real quick, and just show you what it looks like. So if you go to The Art of Communication, and this is on, his website, and then his Facebook group is also The Art of Communication. It's a group that you have to join, but I highly recommend it because he's giving you tips and tricks on how to be a better communicator, and highly recommend his podcast. It's only been out 6 months, but it is so powerful, and you're gonna learn so many lessons on how to take that next step in and just think about what's one lesson that you can do differently, and connect to someone that's really gonna change your life.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, yeah, the podcast Art of Communication, you can find it on all the major podcast platforms. The website is just gregjrice.com. It's my middle initial, gregjrice.com. You can also find the podcast there. And then just recently, actually, I launched, I partnered with another group of folks who do a lot of language training, the top body language trainers in the world for business owners anyway. And they put together a free 6-week course in body language training. So it's like mini lessons over 6 weeks. And we're giving that away for free. And you can find that at bodylanguagemastery.gregjrice.com. So that's bodylanguagemastery.gregjrice.com.
Okay, spell that again for me.
Spell it? Oh, it's body language mastery.
Mastery, and then Greg?
Yeah. Bodylanguagemastery.gregjrice.com.
Gosh, hang on.
Yeah,
J-Rice.
it's a little long.
It's okay. Alright, so this is gonna be on the ticker, so if I've spelled this wrong, okay, it's Body Language Mastery dot gregjrice.com. So when you're looking at this on YouTube, as it's coming
Perfect.
across, yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you very much for sharing that.
For sure. And I'll take you straight to where you can register for that course.
Excellent, excellent. Greg, you are just a joy. Thank you so much for everything you're doing. Thank you for sharing, and I thank you for hosting me as a guest on your podcast. I really appreciate it. It was awesome. And please come back and share with us what's happening in your life. Give us some updates, will you?
Will do. Will do. I really appreciate you having me on the show. And I look forward to joining you in the Airstream at some point in the near future.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Got you down. Thank you, thank you. Have a great night, and everyone, whatever you're doing this week, remember that you can change your life. Being an everyday leader, it's the first decision that you make every single day to step into your life, invest in yourself, and do something, improve your life, and also add value to someone else, maybe that you don't even know. Have a great night. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you real soon back here on the Everyday Leaders platform. Have a great night.